The faint hum of the office building was a familiar comfort as I worked through the latest quarterly numbers. Another late evening was nothing new, and I prided myself on the precision I brought to my work. That's what set me apart, both in my career and personal life. I liked order, I thrived on structure. At least I thought I did. When my phone buzzed, I instinctively glanced at the screen. It was Kimberly, my wife of 11 years. The words in her text were simple, nothing out of the ordinary. Late dinner with colleagues. Don't wait up. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji before putting the phone down, a hint of unease settling in my chest. For weeks now, Kimberly's texts had been variations of the same theme. Late nights. Work obligations. I had no reason to doubt her, she was as dedicated to her career as I was to mine. But there was something off. I noticed it in the little things. The extra care she took with her appearance in the mornings, the sudden increase in gym visits, the perfume she wore sparingly in the past, now a regular companion. At first, I chalked it up to a desire for self-improvement. But self-improvement didn't usually involve being glued to one's phone, whispering in hushed tones at odd hours. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Kimberly was my rock, and I was hers. We'd been through too much together to let paranoia eat away at us now. Or so I thought. When I finally wrapped up for the night and stepped into the cool autumn air, the thought occurred to me to stop by her office. I shook it off immediately. She texted me that she was with colleagues. No sense in invading her privacy. The drive home was uneventful, my mind already on the presentation I had scheduled for the next day. But as I pulled into our driveway, a flicker of light caught my attention. My neighbor Dave stood on his porch with a beer in hand, nodding at me as I stepped out of the car. "Late one, huh?" he called out. "Always," I replied, offering a half-smile. "You should tell Kimberly to give you a break," Dave added, his tone light, but there was something behind his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my grip tightening on my briefcase. "Oh, nothing serious. Just saw her earlier. Looked like she was heading downtown. Dressed to the nines, too." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "She said she had a work dinner," I responded, my voice carefully even. Dave shrugged. "Could be. Just thought it was odd, she got into some guy's car. A sleek black BMW. Didn't recognize him." His words landed like a punch to the gut. But I forced a smile and nodded, retreating into the house before my composure cracked. Inside, the silence was deafening. I stared at my phone, willing myself not to overreact. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I opened my browser and typed, "Private investigator near me." This was just for peace of mind, I told myself. Nothing more. Little did I know, that decision would unravel everything I thought I knew about my wife, and myself. The next morning, I felt the weight of sleeplessness as I prepared for my day. Kimberly had come home sometime past midnight, slipping into bed without waking me. When I woke up, her side of the bed was empty again, her scent lingering faintly on the sheets, a mix of jasmine and something unfamiliar. As I sipped my coffee, my mind replayed Dave's words, a sleek black BMW. I shook it off. No conclusions, no assumptions. Not yet. I'd already made the call to the private investigator, someone recommended on a forum I found late into the night. His name was Ben Carson, a retired cop turned investigator. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my office after lunch. Kimberly texted me mid-morning. "Love you. Don't forget we have dinner with the Parkers tomorrow night." I stared at her message for a long moment, my stomach twisting. It was such a normal thing to say, but it felt hollow, like a script she was rehearsing. I replied quickly, "Love you too. Looking forward to it." When I arrived at the coffee shop, Ben was already there. He was in his late 50s, with a wiry build and sharp blue eyes that seemed to assess everything at once. "Mr. Allen?" he asked, standing and extending a hand. I shook it. "Thanks for meeting me." We sat down, and I launched into a summary of what had been bothering me. The text messages, the late nights, the extra effort Kimberly was putting into her appearance. I tried not to sound paranoid, But as I spoke, it felt like the puzzle pieces were snapping together in ways I hadn't noticed before. "Okay," Ben said, jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "And this black BMW your neighbor mentioned, any idea who it could belong to?" I shook my head. "None. Kimberly doesn't usually talk about her colleagues, except for her boss, Stephen." "Stephen?" Ben's pen paused. "You trust him?" I hesitated. "I don't know. He's personable. Charismatic. But I've never had a reason to question anything about him." Ben leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "I'll start by following her for the next week. If there's nothing to find, you'll know. But if there's something off, I'll get to the bottom of it." As he slid a contract across the table for me to sign, I hesitated. It felt like a betrayal to even consider this, but the unease gnawed at me. I signed. "Let's hope this is just a case of bad timing and coincidence," Ben said, standing. "I'll be in touch." The rest of the day was a blur. Work was an afterthought as my mind replayed every interaction I'd had with Kimberly in the past month. I thought about the last time we'd been truly intimate, the last time she looked at me like I was her everything. I couldn't even pinpoint it. That evening I got home early. Kimberly's car wasn't in the driveway, but I wasn't surprised. She told me she'd be working late. I reheated some leftovers, trying to keep my thoughts in check. It wasn't until I went to the bedroom to change that I noticed her perfume bottle sitting on the dresser. It was nearly empty, though I remembered it being almost full just a week ago. I sank onto the bed, the weight of suspicion pulling me down. My phone buzzed. It was Ben. "Starting tomorrow. Will update you daily." I typed back a quick acknowledgement, staring at the screen long after the message had been sent. The next day, my phone buzzed again as I sat in a morning meeting. Ben's update came through. "She left the office for lunch with a man. Black BMW. Followed them to a restaurant downtown, Luciano's. They seemed close. Nothing incriminating yet, but I'll keep watching." The words blurred as anger simmered beneath my calm exterior. Luciano's. That was our anniversary spot. By the time I got home that night, Kimberly was already in bed, her back turned to me. I stood in the doorway, watching her silhouette in the faint glow of the bedside lamp. "You're home late," she murmured without turning. "Yeah. Long day." She didn't respond, her breathing steady and even. I climbed into bed, every part of me on edge. The truth was coming, I could feel it. And I wasn't sure I was ready for what I'd find. By Thursday morning, Ben's updates had become routine, each one tightening the noose around my hope. Kimberly's patterns were becoming clear, a lunch here, a drink there. Always with the man in the black BMW. His name was Stephen, the boss I'd heard her mention casually over dinner 100 times. Now, his name had a different weight. I couldn't say it without feeling a twinge of anger. When Ben texted me that day, his words left no room for interpretation. "She's at the Royalton Hotel with Stephen. Booked a room. I'll get more details if you want, but it's clear what's happening." The message hit me like a hammer. I stared at my phone for what felt like an eternity, my stomach churning. I forced myself to reply. "Get what you can." The day passed in a haze. I went through the motions at work, barely acknowledging the questions and conversations swirling around me. My colleagues must have noticed, but no one said anything. By the time I left the office, I felt like a shell of myself. That evening, Kimberly walked through the door with her usual breezy confidence. She kissed me on the cheek, her lipstick smudging my skin like a brand. "Long day?" she asked, setting her bag down. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You?" She shrugged, flashing me that practiced smile. "Just the usual. Meetings and more meetings. Sometimes I think they'd fall apart without me." I nodded, biting back the words I wanted to say. After dinner, she retreated to the bedroom, claiming she was exhausted. I sat in the living room, staring at my phone. The messages from Ben were there, each one damning in its own way. Photos attached. Checked out just after 6 p.m. I clicked on the images, each one more devastating than the last. Kimberly and Stephen walking into the hotel lobby. Kimberly leaning into him, her hand on his chest. The two of them leaving hours later, their bodies close, his hand brushing the small of her back. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fact. I spent the night on the couch, unable to sleep. My mind raced through 100 scenarios, each more chaotic than the last. By morning, I knew I couldn't sit on this any longer. I waited for Kimberly to leave for work before calling Ben. I need the hotel receipts, I said, my voice firm. Ben hesitated. That's tricky. It's not exactly legal. Just get them. I interrupted. All right, he said. I'll see what I can do. By Friday evening, the pieces had all fallen into place. The receipts showed multiple visits to the same hotel over the past month, always during the day, always booked under Stephen's name. I stared at the papers Ben handed me in the small cafe where we met. My hands trembled as I thumbed through the evidence, each page like a dagger. What now? Ben asked, his voice cautious. I don't know, I admitted. But I'll figure it out. That night, I confronted Kimberly. She was brushing her hair in front of the mirror when I stepped into the bedroom. I could see her face in the reflection, calm and unbothered, a mask I now realized I'd mistaken for sincerity. We need to talk, I said, closing the door behind me. She turned, her brow furrowing slightly. What's wrong? I know about Stephen, I said, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. Stephen? She repeated, feigning ignorance. Don't, I snapped, my voice rising. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about. I know everything, Kimberly. The lunches. The hotel. The lies. Her face turned pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I hired a private investigator, I continued, my voice shaking with anger. I have photos, receipts, everything. Kimberly's lips trembled as she tried to find the right words. I didn't mean for this to happen, she stammered. I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean for what? To betray me? To destroy everything we built together? How long has this been going on, Kimberly? She looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. A few months, she admitted quietly. A few months, I repeated, shaking my head. Unbelievable. It didn't mean anything, she pleaded. It was just, I don't know, a mistake. A mistake? I shouted. Mistakes don't happen repeatedly over months. Mistakes don't book hotel rooms and sneak around behind your husband's back. She began to cry, but I felt no sympathy. Please, let's talk about this, she begged. There's nothing to talk about, I said coldly. You made your choice. Now I'll make mine. I turned and left the room, slamming the door behind me. As I sat in the living room, staring at the wall, I knew this was only the beginning. Kimberly wasn't just going to walk away from this unscathed. Not if I had anything to say about it. The night after the confrontation was a blur of anger and sleeplessness. I sat in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey that did nothing to dull the ache in my chest. Kimberly stayed locked in the bedroom. I could hear her muffled sobs, but I didn't care. I was too consumed by the storm raging inside me. By morning, I had made up my mind. There was no salvaging this. Kimberly had destroyed the trust between us, and I wasn't going to play the role of the forgiving husband. I wasn't going to let her walk away without consequences either. My first call was to Ben. Ben, I said as he picked up. I need to escalate this. What do you mean? He asked cautiously. I want to know everything about Stephen, I said firmly. His finances, his marriage, anything I can use to expose him. Ben hesitated. You sure about this? Once you start digging, there's no going back. There's nothing to go back to, I replied. Just do it. All right, he said. Give me a few days. I ended the call and stared out the window. The autumn leaves were falling, a stark contrast to the chaos in my life. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. The first part of the plan unfolded when I contacted my lawyer, Peter Harlan. Peter was a no-nonsense divorce attorney who had a reputation for being ruthless when needed. "Steven's her boss, right?" Peter asked after I explained the situation. "Yes," I said. "Why does that matter?" "Because if he used company resources for this affair, company credit cards, work trips, it could create a scandal. Especially if his firm has a policy against workplace relationships." A flicker of satisfaction sparked in my chest. "Can we prove that?" "Not yet," Peter admitted. "But we can file a subpoena for his expense reports if this goes to court." "I want to bury him," I said, my voice cold. "And I want Kimberly to know that I'm not backing down." Peter nodded. "Understood. Let's start by drafting the divorce papers. We'll outline everything: her infidelity, the evidence, and any claims you have on assets. Are you aiming for an equitable split, or do you want to fight for more?" I didn't hesitate. "More. Much more." "Then we'll need leverage," Peter said, leaning back in his chair. "Keep digging on Steven. The more dirt we have, the better your position." That night, I returned home to find Kimberly sitting at the dining room table, her face pale and drawn. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "What is there to talk about?" "I made a mistake," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But I still love you. I want to fix this." I laughed bitterly. "Fix this? How do you propose we do that, Kimberly? You think a few therapy sessions are going to erase the fact that you've been sneaking around with your boss for months?" She flinched at my words but pressed on. "I'll quit my job," she said. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't throw this all away." I stared at her, my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You already threw it away," I said, my voice low. "The moment you decided that my loyalty and love weren't enough for you." Her tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. "Have you told Steven?" I asked, the question dripping with venom. "Told him what?" she whispered. "That I know. That this is over." She shook her head. "I haven't spoken to him since last night." "Good," I said coldly. "Because he's next on my list." She looked up at me, panic flashing in her eyes. "What are you going to do?" "You'll find out soon enough," I said, turning and heading upstairs. The next day, Ben called with an update. "You were right," he said. "Steven's been using company funds to bankroll this affair. Hotel stays, dinners, even a trip to Miami a few weeks ago." My blood boiled. "Anything else?" "His wife doesn't know," Ben continued. "But I can fix that if you want." "Do it," I said. "Consider it done," he replied. The next move was mine. I sent a package to Steven's wife, Rachel. It contained copies of the photos, hotel receipts, and a letter detailing the affair in excruciating detail. I included my contact information, should she want to confirm any of it. By the end of the week, my phone rang. It was Rachel. "You're the husband, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," I said. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice hardening. "I had my suspicions, but I never imagined this." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I thought you deserved to know." "So do you," she said. "Steven's not just unfaithful, he's reckless. There's something else you should know." "What?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated before speaking. "Steven's been hiding money. Offshore accounts. I found the statements years ago, but he convinced me it was for tax reasons. If you want to hurt him, that's where you start." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. "Thank you, Rachel." This wasn't just about Kimberly anymore. Steven had destroyed my marriage. Now, I was going to destroy his life. The next few days were a whirlwind of coordination and quiet preparation. Kimberly tried to act normal, slipping in small acts of kindness, like making my coffee or leaving little notes on my desk. It was pathetic, and I saw through it. Each gesture only deepened my resolve. I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Ben's next update came late one evening. I sat in my car outside the gym, where Kimberly had said she was taking a stress relief yoga class. Watching her walk into the building in her carefully selected workout gear had stirred a mixture of disgust and sorrow in me, but I shoved it aside as I answered Ben's call. "I've got the details on Steven's accounts," Ben began. "He's been siphoning company money into 2 offshore accounts, one in the Cayman Islands and another in Singapore." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Rough estimate? $500,000, maybe more. He's been funneling it slowly, but steadily, over the last few years." "That's perfect," I said. "Can you get the specifics?" "Already working on it," Ben replied. "But I should warn you, this could get messy. Once this information comes out, Steven's company could go after him for embezzlement, and if they tie Kimberly into any misuse of funds..." "She's not innocent," I said coldly. "She can deal with the fallout." Ben was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "What's your endgame, Mr. Allen? Revenge? Exposure? Divorce?" "All of it," I said firmly. "All right," Ben said. "I'll keep digging." That night, I returned home to find Kimberly sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed. "I made dinner," she said softly. "I'm not hungry," I replied, brushing past her. "Please," she said, standing and following me into the kitchen. "We need to talk." I turned to face her, my patience wearing thin. "Talk about what, Kimberly? About how you threw away everything we built for a man who doesn't give a damn about you." "That's not true," she whispered. "Steven cares about me." I laughed bitterly. "Does he? Because from where I'm standing, he seems to care more about keeping his affair quiet than about you." Her face crumpled, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "What do you want me to say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That I'm sorry? That I made a terrible mistake? Because I am, and I did." "It's too late for apologies," I said coldly. "You made your choice. Now you get to live with the consequences." She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand to stop her. "Just drop it, Kimberly," I said. "This conversation is over." I walked upstairs, leaving her standing in the kitchen, her wine glass trembling in her hand. The next day, I had a meeting with Peter to finalize the divorce strategy. "We're in a good position," he said, laying out the papers on his desk. "Between the evidence of her infidelity and what Ben's uncovered about Steven's financial misconduct, we have plenty of leverage." "Good," I said. "I want to hit her where it hurts." Peter nodded. "We'll request sole ownership of the house, a larger share of the savings, and full custody of any joint assets. With the offshore accounts in play, we might even be able to push for damages." "Make it happen," I said. By Friday, Ben had provided everything I needed to take Steven down. Armed with the details of his offshore accounts and evidence of his embezzlement, I made my move. My first call was to Steven's company's board of directors. I left an anonymous tip about the misuse of company funds, directing them to the specific accounts Ben had uncovered. My second call was to a journalist I knew, feeding them the same information. By the end of the day, the news was out. Steven's company announced an internal investigation, and the whispers of scandal began to spread. That evening, Kimberly stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. "What did you do?" she demanded, slamming the door behind her. I looked up from my laptop, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Steven called me," she said, her voice shaking. "His accounts are frozen. The company's investigating him. He said you're behind it." I smirked. "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. Either way, he's getting exactly what he deserves. And so are you." Her eyes filled with tears. "How could you do this? How could I do this?" I snapped, standing to face her. You're the one who betrayed me, who lied to me for months. You don't get to play the victim here, Kimberly. She stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to find the words. Finally, she whispered, I didn't think you could be so cruel. I laughed bitterly. You don't know me as well as you thought you did. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control again. The fallout from my actions against Stephen unfolded faster than I expected. By Monday morning, his name was splashed across news websites and whispered in corporate offices. Accusations of embezzlement and misconduct were swirling, and the board of his company announced his suspension pending a full investigation. I followed the chaos from the sidelines, my emotions a mix of grim satisfaction and icy resolve. Kimberly barely spoke to me over the weekend, retreating into silence punctuated by occasional attempts to engage me in conversation. I brushed her off each time, too focused on the plan to let her manipulate my emotions. But the real reckoning began on Monday evening, when Stephen's wife, Rachel, called me again. Have you seen the news? She asked, her tone sharp. Yes, I said. I told you this was coming. Well, it's worse than that, she continued. Stephen showed up at the house this afternoon. He's blaming you for everything, saying you've ruined his life. And what did you say? I asked. I told him to leave, Rachel said. But he's desperate. He knows his career is over if these accusations stick. He begged me to help him. Don't, I said firmly. I'm not planning to, she replied. But I thought you should know, he's threatening to come after you. I laughed bitterly. Let him try. He's already lost. Rachel hesitated. Just be careful. Stephen's the type to lash out when he's cornered. Thanks for the warning, I said, ending the call. That night, Kimberly finally broke her silence. As I sat at the dining room table reviewing paperwork for the divorce, she entered the room, her face pale and drawn. We need to talk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced up, my patience already wearing thin. About what? About us, she said, taking a hesitant step forward. There is no us, I said coldly, returning my attention to the documents. Her voice cracked. I made a mistake, but does that mean you have to destroy everything? You're ruining my life, and for what? Revenge? I slammed the papers down, my anger bubbling over. You ruined your own life, Kimberly. Don't you dare pin this on me. She flinched, but I didn't stop. You lied to me, cheated on me, and now you want sympathy because you're finally facing the consequences of your actions? You don't get to play the victim here. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I'm not trying to be the victim. I just want a chance to make things right. There's no making this right, I said, my voice firm. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. She sank into the chair across from me, her hands trembling. I still love you, she whispered. I shook my head. No, Kimberly. You loved the idea of me, the stability, the security. But you didn't love me enough to stay faithful. And now it's too late. She sobbed quietly, but I felt nothing. The next morning, I received an unexpected call from Peter. We have a problem, he said, his tone serious. What kind of problem? I asked, already bracing for bad news. Stephen's lawyers are pushing back hard. Peter explained. They're claiming that your actions, exposing his financial misconduct, were motivated purely by personal revenge. They're threatening to countersue for defamation. Defamation? I repeated, my anger flaring. The evidence is solid. He's guilty. Doesn't matter, Peter said. If they can prove malicious intent, it could complicate things. I clenched my jaw. What do we do? Stay calm, Peter said. We'll file a formal response and keep building your case. But be prepared, this might get ugly. The tension in the house was unbearable. Kimberly avoided me entirely, retreating to the guest room and leaving the house for hours at a time. I didn't ask where she was going, and I didn't care. But one evening, as I sat in my office, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Rachel standing there, her expression a mix of determination and fear. "We need to talk," she said. I stepped aside, letting her in. "What's going on?" I asked. "Stephen knows about us working together," she said, her voice tight. "He's furious. He's threatening to go public with everything if we don't back off." "Let him," I said. "He's already lost." Rachel shook her head. "You don't understand. He's desperate. If we keep pushing, he'll do whatever it takes to take us down with him." I crossed my arms, my resolve unshaken. "Let him try. I'm not backing down." Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "Just be careful, all right? Stephen's not the type to go quietly." I nodded, watching as she left. The storm was far from over, but I was ready. Stephen and Kimberly had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. But deep down, I knew this fight was only beginning. The tension around me grew thicker by the day. Stephen's public suspension and the ongoing investigation into his financial misconduct were becoming the talk of the town. News outlets had picked up the story, and his once polished reputation was now in tatters. But Stephen wasn't backing down. That much became clear when I found an envelope slipped under my front door one evening. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed and unsigned. "You think you're clever, but you don't know who you're messing with. Drop this now, or you'll regret it." I stared at the note, my blood running cold. Was this a bluff? A scare tactic? Or was Stephen truly as dangerous as Rachel had warned? I grabbed my phone and dialed Peter immediately. "Peter, I just got a threat," I said, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "What kind of threat?" Peter asked, his tone sharpening. I described the note, and he sighed. "This could be Stephen trying to intimidate you. But don't take it lightly. I'll contact law enforcement and let them know what's going on. Keep the note for evidence." I agreed and ended the call, but my mind was racing. Kimberly's affair with Stephen had turned my life upside down, but this was different. This wasn't about betrayal or divorce anymore. This was a battle, and Stephen had just raised the stakes. The next day, I woke to find Kimberly sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone with a distant look in her eyes. "You're up early," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She glanced at me, her face pale. "I got a call from Stephen last night." I set my mug down, my jaw tightening. "What did he say?" "He's unraveling," she said quietly. "He told me he knows you're behind everything, and he's not going to let you win." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Good luck to him. He's already lost." Kimberly looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, fear, guilt, or maybe both. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. I laughed bitterly. "Why am I doing this? Are you seriously asking me that after everything you've done?" Her lips trembled. "I know I hurt you. I know I made a mistake. But this is too far. You're destroying lives. Lives that deserve to be destroyed," I said coldly. "Stephen didn't care about the lives he was wrecking when he pursued you, and you didn't care about mine when you betrayed me. Now you both get to deal with the consequences." She said nothing, her silence as damning as her actions. That afternoon, Peter called with an update. "We've filed a restraining order against Stephen," he said. "It's mostly precautionary, but it should keep him from making any direct threats." "And what about the countersuit?" I asked. "We're holding steady," Peter said. "The evidence we have on his embezzlement outweighs any claim of defamation. He's in a weak position, legally speaking." "Good," I said. "Let's keep it that way." But as much as Peter's words reassured me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Stephen wasn't done. That evening, Rachel called again. Her voice was shaking. "Stephen's lost it," she said. "He came home drunk and started screaming about how he's going to ruin you. I had to lock myself in the bedroom to get away from him." My stomach churned. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "For now. But I don't know what he's planning. He keeps mentioning something about your wife." The words sent a chill down my spine. What about Kimberly? I don't know, Rachel admitted. But you should keep an eye on her. Stephen's not thinking clearly. After hanging up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The next day, I noticed Kimberly acting strangely. She was jumpy, her phone always clutched tightly in her hand. At one point, I walked into the room, and she quickly ended a call, her face flushed. Who was that? I asked, my suspicion mounting. Just a friend, she said quickly, avoiding my gaze. But I wasn't convinced. Later that night, when she went to take a shower, I took her phone from the nightstand and unlocked it. My heart sank as I scrolled through her recent messages. There it was. Stephen, we need to meet. It's urgent. Kimberly, I can't. It's too risky. Stephen, if you don't, he'll find out everything. Don't make me do this. The knot in my stomach tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. Stephen wasn't just threatening me, he was using Kimberly as a pawn in his desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his life. I put the phone back just as I'd found it, my mind racing. Stephen was unraveling, and Kimberly was caught in the crossfire. But if Stephen thought he could use her against me, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The tension in the house was suffocating. Kimberly avoided me more than usual, and I let her. Her actions were as transparent as glass now, every furtive glance at her phone, every whispered call when she thought I wasn't listening. Stephen's influence still lingered, like a parasite clinging to the last vestiges of her resolve. I was waiting for the moment it all came to a head. That moment arrived sooner than I expected. On Friday evening, Kimberly announced she was going out to meet a friend for drinks. Her tone was casual, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Which friend? I asked, folding my arms as I leaned against the doorway. She faltered, her gaze darting toward her purse. Just someone from work. You don't know her. I studied her carefully. All right, I said, my tone neutral. Have fun. Her relief was almost palpable as she grabbed her coat and hurried out the door. I waited until her car pulled out of the driveway before following her. Ben had installed a tracker on her car earlier that week, a precaution I'd reluctantly agreed to. Now, as I sat in my own car, watching her taillights disappear into the distance, I was grateful for it. The app on my phone showed her heading toward the outskirts of town. My pulse quickened as I followed, keeping a safe distance. She eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small motel. My stomach churned as I watched her get out of the car, her movements tense and hurried. A man stepped out of the shadows to greet her, Stephen. I parked across the street, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The anger coursing through me was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to see this through. They entered one of the motel rooms together, and I waited, my mind racing with possibilities. After 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of the car and crossed the street, my footsteps deliberate. When I reached the door to their room, I knocked sharply. Inside, there was a flurry of movement. I heard muffled voices, Kimberly's frantic, Stephen's low and commanding. The door opened a crack, and Stephen's face appeared, his expression twisting into a sneer when he saw me. Well, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Look who decided to join us. Let me in, I said, my voice cold and even. Stephen smirked. I don't think so. Kimberly and I are in the middle of a private conversation. Let him in, Stephen, Kimberly said from somewhere behind him, her voice trembling. Stephen hesitated, then stepped aside with a mocking bow. By all means. I entered the room, my eyes immediately locking onto Kimberly. She stood by the bed, her face pale and her arms crossed defensively. What the hell is this? I demanded, my gaze shifting between the two of them. Relax, Stephen said, closing the door behind me. We're just talking. Talking? I scoffed. About what? How you're going to get out of the mess you've made? Stephen's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. You don't know what you're dealing with, Alan. You think you've won, but you've only scratched the surface. I took a step closer, my fists clenched at my sides. I know everything I need to. I know you've been embezzling money, cheating on your wife, and using my wife to cover your tracks. And now your life is falling apart because of it. Stephen's face darkened, and he took a step forward, his voice low and threatening. You think you're so righteous, don't you? But you're just as dirty as the rest of us. Do you really think your wife didn't play her part in all of this? Enough. Kimberly's voice cut through the tension, sharp and desperate. Both of you, just stop. We both turned to her, and for a moment the room was silent. This is over, Kimberly said, her voice trembling. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have done any of this. But it's over now. Stephen laughed bitterly. You think you can just walk away? After everything? Yes, she said firmly, though her voice wavered. I can. I stepped forward, my gaze locked on Stephen. You heard her. It's over. You've lost. Take what little dignity you have left, and leave before this gets worse for you. Stephen's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But then he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Have it your way. But don't think this is the end. He turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Kimberly sank onto the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. You should have thought about that before you got involved with him, I said, my voice cold. This mess is yours to clean up. She looked up at me, her eyes red and filled with regret. I'm sorry, she whispered. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, turning to leave. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of calm. Stephen was desperate, but his grip on Kimberly, and on my life, was slipping. The game was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I was winning. The confrontation at the motel left an indelible mark. I replayed every word, every glance, every moment as I drove home that night. Kimberly's tear-streaked face haunted me, but it was Stephen's venomous smirk that stuck with me the most. He wasn't finished. I could feel it. When I got home, the silence felt heavier than ever. Kimberly didn't follow me back that night, and I didn't call to ask where she was. I didn't care. This was her mess, and I was done cleaning it up for her. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a call from Rachel. Stephen didn't come home last night, she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. Did you expect him to? I asked, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee. I don't know, she admitted. But I need to know what happened last night. What did you say to him? I filled her in, recounting the confrontation in as much detail as I could. She listened in silence, her breath shallow on the other end of the line. He's unraveling, she said when I finished. I don't know what he'll do next, but I'm scared, David. He's not just going to let this go. Let him come at me, I said firmly. I'm not afraid of him. Rachel hesitated. Maybe you should be. Stephen's always been ruthless, but now he has nothing to lose. That makes him dangerous. I didn't respond, but her words lingered long after the call ended. Later that afternoon, Peter called with another update. We've received a formal countersuit from Stephen's lawyers, he said. They're alleging defamation and interference with contractual relations. They're claiming your actions have caused irreparable harm to Stephen's reputation and career. I let out a bitter laugh. Irreparable harm? He did that to himself the moment he started stealing company money and sleeping with my wife. True, Peter said. But they're trying to shift the blame onto you. We'll need to tread carefully from here on out. What do we do? I asked. We fight, Peter said simply. But be prepared for a long and messy battle. Stephen isn't going to back down quietly. Neither am I said. That evening, Kimberly finally came home. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her face pale and her hair unkempt. She set her keys on the counter and stood there for a moment, as if gathering the courage to speak. David, she said softly, can we talk? I set my drink down and crossed my arms. What is there to talk about, Kimberly? You've already said everything that matters. I know, she said, her voice trembling. But I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Fix us? Kimberly, there is no us anymore. You destroyed that the moment you chose Stephen over me. I didn't choose him, she insisted. I was lost. Confused. But I never stopped loving you. Her words hit like a dull thud, but they didn't move me. I'd heard them before, and they rang hollow. If you loved me, I said coldly, you wouldn't have betrayed me. Love doesn't survive lies and deceit, Kimberly. It withers and dies. She looked down, tears spilling onto her cheeks. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I stood, my patience gone. The only thing you can do to make this right is to sign the divorce papers and stay out of my way. Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded silently and walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The next few days passed in a blur of legal filings and tense phone calls. Ben continued feeding me updates on Stephen's movements, and Peter prepared our countersuit to Stephen's countersuit. The legal web was growing more tangled by the day, but I was determined to see it through. Then, on Thursday evening, Ben called with news that sent a chill down my spine. Stephen's hired someone, he said. Hired someone? For what? To dig up dirt on you, Ben replied. A private investigator. He's trying to find anything he can use to discredit you or turn the tables in court. I clenched my jaw. Let him try. I've got nothing to hide. Just be careful, Ben warned. This is turning into a dangerous game, and Stephen's playing for keeps. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts churning. Stephen's desperation was growing, and his moves were becoming more erratic. I needed to stay one step ahead, but the constant pressure was starting to wear on me. As I drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, a single thought echoed in my mind. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. The storm surrounding Stephen and Kimberly escalated over the following week, with every new revelation dragging us all closer to the edge of disaster. My life had become a battlefield, each day marked by legal maneuvers, thinly veiled threats, and the constant undercurrent of tension at home. Kimberly was a shadow of her former self. She tried to engage me in conversations, but I barely gave her the time of day. Every word she said felt like another layer of manipulation, another attempt to salvage what she'd destroyed. I wasn't interested. But it wasn't just Stephen or Kimberly I had to worry about anymore. Rachel called me late one evening, her voice tight with anxiety. I think Stephen's tailing me, she said, her words coming in short bursts. I've seen the same car parked near my house for 3 days now. I'm scared, David. Have you called the police? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. They said they can't do much unless he does something overt, she replied. But I know it's him. He's watching me, trying to intimidate me. I exhaled sharply. Stay safe, Rachel. If you need anything, call me. Thank you, she whispered. But you should be careful too. He blames you for everything, David. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. Her warning settled heavily in my chest as I hung up. The next day, Ben called with news that only heightened my unease. I've been keeping tabs on Stephen, like you asked, he said. And he's been meeting with some questionable people. Debt collectors, lawyers, and a few guys who don't exactly look like financial advisors. What are you saying, Ben? I'm saying Stephen's in deeper trouble than we thought, Ben replied. And he's getting desperate. You need to watch your back. Let him come, I said, though my stomach churned. Ben sighed. Desperation makes people unpredictable, David. Don't underestimate him. That evening, as I sat in my office going over Peter's latest legal brief, I heard a knock at the door. It was strange. Unexpected visitors weren't common at our house, especially not at 9 p.m. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding. Through the peephole, I saw Kimberly standing on the porch, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. I opened the door, my expression cold. "What is it?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "Can we talk?" "We've talked enough," I said, closing the door behind her. "Please, David," she said, her voice trembling. "This is important." I crossed my arms, waiting. "I think Stephen's planning something," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's been calling me nonstop, saying things like I won't let him win and you owe me for this. He even said he knows where you keep important things." My blood ran cold. "What is he talking about, Kimberly?" She looked down, wringing her hands. "I don't know, but I'm scared. Stephen's losing it. He's not just angry anymore, he's vengeful." "Vengeful?" I said bitterly. "He's been vengeful since the day I exposed him." "I mean dangerous," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's planning to hurt you, David. And maybe me, too." I studied her face, searching for signs of deception, but all I saw was fear. Genuine or not, it didn't change the fact that Stephen was becoming a real threat. "Stay out of this, Kimberly," I said, my tone firm. "I'll handle Stephen." "You can't handle him alone," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please let me help you." "Help me?" I scoffed. "You helped him destroy my life. Why would I trust you now?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I turned away, unwilling to let her manipulate me any further. The next morning, I met with Peter to discuss our next move. "Stephen's grasping at straws," Peter said, tapping a pen against his desk. "The countersuit is weak, but he's using it to stall. He's hoping you'll back down before he's completely exposed." "Not a chance," I said firmly. "Good," Peter replied. "Because we're close to shutting him down entirely. I've been in touch with the company's board, and they're ready to cut ties with him as soon as the investigation is complete. Once that happens, his reputation, and his career, will be in ruins." I nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. But beneath that, there was unease. Stephen's unraveling was accelerating, and with it, his desperation. As I left Peter's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that Stephen's next move would be his boldest, and most dangerous, yet. That evening, as I sat at home, my phone buzzed with a text from Ben. "Stephen's been seen near your neighborhood. Be careful." I stood, peering out the window into the dark street. My pulse quickened as I scanned for anything out of place. And then I saw it, a black sedan idling at the corner, its headlights off. A chill ran down my spine as I grabbed my phone and called Ben. "He's here," I said. "Stay inside," Ben replied. "I'm on my way." I hung up, my hands trembling as I locked the doors and checked the windows. Stephen was close, too close. And for the first time, I wondered if this battle would cost me more than I'd bargained for. The black sedan sat at the corner like a predator lurking in the shadows. Its presence sent a chill through me, but I refused to give in to fear. This was Stephen's game, intimidation, mind games, trying to rattle me enough to make me fold. But I wasn't going to fold. Not now. I locked the front door, double-checking every window and entrance in the house. My mind raced as I tried to anticipate his next move. Ben arrived within 15 minutes, pulling up behind Stephen's car without hesitation. His SUV's headlights bathed the sedan in a harsh glare. I watched from the window as Ben stepped out, his tall, wiry frame exuding calm confidence. The sedan's door opened, and Stephen emerged, his movements slow and deliberate. Even from a distance, I could see the fury etched into his face. "You're bold," Ben said, his voice carrying across the street. Stephen smirked, his hands shoved casually into his pockets. "Just making sure David knows I'm not going anywhere." Ben didn't flinch. "You're playing a dangerous game, Stephen. You don't scare him, and you sure as hell don't scare me." "Scare him?" Stephen laughed bitterly. "I'm not here to scare him. I'm here to show him what happens when you destroy someone's life." I opened the door and stepped outside, unable to stay in the shadows any longer. "Destroy your life?" I called out, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. You did that yourself, Stephen. All I did was expose the truth. Stephen's head snapped toward me, his smirk fading. You think you're so righteous, don't you? Exposing my secrets, ruining my career. Do you even care about the collateral damage you've caused? You're the one who dragged Kimberly into this. I shot back, stepping closer. You used her, manipulated her, and now you're trying to play the victim? She came to me. Stephen snapped, his voice rising. She was miserable with you. I gave her what she needed. Ben took a step forward, placing himself between us. That's enough, he said firmly. You've already crossed too many lines, Stephen. Leave now, or I'll call the cops. Stephen's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. This isn't over, he growled. Without another word, he climbed back into the sedan and drove off, his tires screeching as he disappeared into the night. Ben turned to me, his expression grim. He's not done, he said. I know, I replied, my fists clenched at my sides. The next morning, I woke to a barrage of notifications on my phone. Stephen had made his next move. Social media was flooded with posts accusing me of harassment, slander, and vindictive behavior. Fake accounts had been created to spread lies about my personal life, painting me as an unstable and vengeful ex-husband. The accusations were ridiculous, but the damage was real. My phone buzzed with calls and messages from friends and colleagues, all asking if the rumors were true. I called Peter immediately. He's trying to turn the narrative against you, Peter said. We need to respond quickly. How? I asked, pacing the living room. By staying calm and letting the evidence speak for itself, Peter replied. We have the receipts, literally. The truth is on your side, but we need to be strategic about how we use it. I nodded, though the frustration in my chest felt like it was going to explode. Kimberly, to her credit, stayed out of my way. She didn't try to defend Stephen or plead with me to back down. For once, she seemed to understand that her involvement would only make things worse. But her silence wasn't enough to stop the chaos. Later that day, I received an unexpected email from Rachel. Subject: Stephen's next move. Message: David, I found something you need to see. Stephen left his laptop open, and I saw an email chain with his lawyers. He's planning to file for a restraining order against you, claiming you've been threatening him and stalking his family. He's going to use it to discredit you in court. My stomach churned as I read her words. Stephen was escalating, and his tactics were becoming more dangerous. I called Ben, filling him in on Rachel's email. He's trying to box you in, Ben said. If he gets that restraining order, it'll undermine your entire case against him. Then we need to stop him, I said. Ben hesitated. There's one way to do that, but it's risky. What is it? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Go public first, he said. Release the evidence you have, the photos, the financial records, everything. Get ahead of his narrative and make it impossible for him to play the victim. I swallowed hard. Going public meant exposing everything, the affair, the embezzlement, the lies. It would destroy any chance of salvaging my private life. But Stephen had left me no choice. Do it, I said. By the next morning, the truth was out. Ben and Peter had coordinated a press release, backed by irrefutable evidence of Stephen's misconduct. The story spread like wildfire, and the public quickly turned against him. But as satisfying as it was to watch Stephen's facade crumble, I knew this wasn't the end. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. You've crossed the line, David. Now it's personal. I stared at the message, my pulse pounding. Stephen's games weren't over. They were just beginning. The text message lingered in my mind like a dark cloud, its warning echoing with every passing hour. Stephen was losing everything, his reputation, his career, and his carefully constructed facade. But instead of retreating, he was doubling down, determined to drag me into the chaos he had created. I showed the message to Ben the next morning during our meeting at a cafe. He's bluffing, Ben said, though his tone carried an edge of uncertainty. He knows he's cornered, but he's trying to rattle you. Don't let him. I'm not rattled, I replied, though the tension in my voice betrayed me. Good, Ben said, leaning back in his chair. Because if he escalates again, he'll only strengthen our case. He's self-destructing, and the more he lashes out, the better it is for us. But his reassurances did little to ease my growing unease. The next move came 2 days later. It started with a phone call from Rachel, her voice trembling with urgency. David, Stephen's gone off the rails, she said. He showed up at the house last night, drunk and ranting about how he's going to make you pay. I had to lock the doors and call the police. What happened? I asked, gripping the phone tightly. They escorted him away, but he's not in jail. They said it was a domestic disturbance and let him go after sobering up. I clenched my jaw, anger boiling beneath the surface. Stephen was spiraling, and it was only a matter of time before he did something reckless. That evening, Kimberly approached me with a cautious expression. I heard about Stephen, she said. Rachel called me. I looked up from my laptop, my patience wearing thin. And? He's dangerous, David, she said, her voice trembling. Maybe we should back off. Let the courts handle it from here. I laughed bitterly, standing and pacing the room. Back off? After everything he's done? After everything you helped him do? She flinched, but I pressed on. This isn't just about revenge, Kimberly. It's about accountability. Stephen needs to face the consequences of his actions, and if you had any decency left, you'd help make that happen. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. She had chosen her side long ago, and now she was reaping the consequences. The breaking point came 2 nights later. I was working late in my office when the sound of shattering glass jolted me from my thoughts. My heart pounded as I rushed downstairs, finding a brick lying in the middle of the living room floor, surrounded by shards of glass from the broken window. Kimberly appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale with fear. What's happening? I picked up the brick, finding a note tied to it with a piece of string. Unfolding the paper, I read the words scrawled in bold, angry letters. This isn't over. Kimberly's voice trembled as she asked. Was it Stephen? Who else? I said through gritted teeth. I called Ben and the police, reporting the incident and handing over the note as evidence. The officers took statements and promised to increase patrols in the area, but it felt like little more than a band-aid on a wound that was still bleeding. As the officers left, Ben pulled me aside. This is escalating fast, he said. We need to file a restraining order immediately. Stephen's becoming more unpredictable by the day. Do it, I said. The next morning, Rachel called again, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Stephen didn't come home last night, she said. I don't know where he is, but I'm scared, David. He's not thinking rationally anymore. Neither am I muttered under my breath. What do we do? She asked, desperation creeping into her voice. We keep pushing, I said firmly. Stephen's lashing out because he knows he's losing. He's running out of options, and sooner or later, he'll slip up. I hope you're right, she said softly. As the day wore on, I felt the pressure mounting. Stephen's actions weren't just about revenge, they were a declaration of war. And the battlefield was my life. I returned home that evening, my mind racing with plans and contingencies. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door was ajar. I stepped out of the car slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The house was eerily quiet as I pushed the door open wider, scanning the darkened interior. Kimberly? I called out, my voice echoing through the silence. There was no answer. My heart raced as I moved through the house, checking each room. When I reached the bedroom, I found a note taped to the mirror. It was Stephen's handwriting again. You took everything from me. Now it's my turn. I spun around, scanning the room for any sign of what Stephen might have done. My stomach dropped as I noticed Kimberly's jewelry box overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number, my hands trembling. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Kimberly, it's me," I said, my voice tight with panic. "Call me back as soon as you get this. I think Steven's done something." As I ended the call, a chill ran down my spine. Steven wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. He was making this personal, and Kimberly was caught in the crossfire. The note on the mirror was chilling, but the unanswered call to Kimberly sent my anxiety into overdrive. She was reckless and self-centered, but this wasn't like her. My mind raced through every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. I immediately called Ben. "She's missing," I said, my voice tight. "I think Steven's involved." "Are you sure?" Ben asked, his tone steady but urgent. "He left a note in my house, and her things are scattered everywhere," I replied. "I tried calling her, but she's not answering." Ben exhaled sharply. "Call the police. File a missing person report. I'll start digging on my end." I ended the call and dialed the police. As I explained the situation, the operator assured me that an officer would be dispatched immediately. But waiting felt unbearable. The officer who arrived was a young man named Delgado, his expression a mix of concern and professionalism. "We'll start by gathering some basic details," he said, taking out a notepad. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" "Last night," I said. "She went to bed early, and I stayed up working. This morning, I left for work before she got up. When I came home, the house was like this." Delgado nodded. "And you believe Stephen Harrow is involved?" "Yes," I said firmly. "He's been stalking us, threatening me, and now my wife is missing. He left this note." I handed over the crumpled paper, watching as Delgado read it. His expression darkened. "This is serious," he said. "We'll issue a bolo for Stephen and your wife. Do you have a recent photo of her?" I pulled up a picture on my phone and sent it to him. Delgado promised to keep me updated before leaving to file the report. The hours dragged on, each one stretching my nerves to their breaking point. Rachel called to check in, her voice filled with worry. "I've been trying to reach Stephen all day," she said. "He's not answering. This isn't like him, David. He's unhinged, but he doesn't disappear like this." "What are you saying?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "I think he's desperate," she replied. "And desperate people do dangerous things." Her words settled like lead in my stomach. At 11 p.m., Ben called with an update. "I found something," he said. "What is it?" "A charge on Stephen's credit card," Ben replied. "A motel outside town. He booked a room there about 2 hours ago." My heart raced. "You think Kimberly's with him?" "It's possible," Ben said. "But we need to be careful. If you show up there alone, it could escalate." "I don't care," I said, grabbing my keys. "Text me the address." "David, wait," Ben began, but I hung up before he could finish. The motel was a rundown, single-story building on the outskirts of town. Its flickering neon sign cast an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. I parked a block away and approached on foot, my heart pounding in my chest. Room 7. That's where Ben said the charge was tied. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear any sounds from inside. There was nothing but silence. Taking a deep breath, I pounded on the door. "Stephen! Open up!" No response. I tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. Pushing the door open cautiously, I stepped inside. The room was empty, but the signs of recent activity were unmistakable. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the nightstand, and the bed was unmade. Kimberly's scarf was draped over the chair, its vibrant color stark against the dingy room. A rush of relief and panic hit me simultaneously. She had been here. But where was she now? As I scanned the room, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Looking for her? You're getting warmer." I gritted my teeth, the rage building inside me. I replied immediately. "Where is she?" The response came seconds later. "Come to the old mill." "Alone?" The old mill was a crumbling relic from the town's industrial past, abandoned and forgotten. Its shadow loomed in the moonlight as I approached, my heart racing. I parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air was thick with tension as I made my way toward the entrance. Inside, the mill was dark and cavernous, the faint smell of rust and decay filling my nostrils. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the building, my eyes scanning every shadow. "David!" The voice sent a chill down my spine. Stephen stepped out of the shadows, his face pale and twisted with fury. He held a gun, its barrel gleaming in the dim light. "Where is she?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. "She's fine," Stephen said, his tone mocking. "For now. Let her go," I said, taking a step forward. Stephen raised the gun, stopping me in my tracks. "You don't get to make demands. You've taken everything from me, David. My career, my reputation, my life. Now it's your turn to lose. You did this to yourself," I shot back. "You destroyed your own life. Let Kimberly go, and we can end this." Stephen laughed bitterly. "End this? Oh, we're just getting started." From somewhere deeper in the mill, I heard a muffled cry. My blood ran cold. "Kimberly!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the vast space. "She's safe," Stephen said, his smirk returning. "But how long she stays that way is up to you." The weight of the moment pressed down on me, every nerve in my body screaming for action. This was it, the showdown I'd been dreading. Stephen's smirk was maddening, his hands steady on the gun as he gestured for me to step back. "You've always thought you were better than me, David," he sneered. "But here we are, and I'm the one in control now. Where is she?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Stephen tilted his head, mockingly contemplative. "She's close. Safe for now. But that depends on you." I clenched my fists, my mind racing for a way to defuse the situation. "You think this makes you powerful? Threatening people, holding a gun? You've already lost, Stephen. This isn't going to fix anything." His expression darkened. "You don't get it, do you? You've taken everything from me, my career, my family, my reputation. You think I'm just going to walk away?" I took a cautious step forward, my voice steady. "You've already lost all of that because of your own actions, Stephen. But this will only make things worse. Put the gun down, and we can talk." He laughed bitterly. "Talk? You think I want to talk? The only thing I want is to see you suffer the way I've suffered." From somewhere deeper in the mill, I heard a muffled cry again. My heart pounded as I glanced toward the sound, then back at Stephen. "Let her go," I said firmly. "She's not part of this anymore." Stephen's face twisted with rage. "She was always part of this. She came to me, David. She begged for something you couldn't give her. You manipulated her," I shot back. "Used her for your own selfish gains. And now you're throwing her under the bus to save yourself." His hand wavered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of the gun and twisting it away from me. The shot rang out, deafening in the cavernous space, the bullet ricocheting off the metal beams behind us. Stephen stumbled backward, his grip on the gun faltering as I wrenched it from his hands and tossed it aside. We collided, grappling in the dim light, our movements desperate and wild. Stephen threw a punch that glanced off my jaw, and I retaliated, landing a blow to his ribs that made him stagger. "Where is she?" I shouted, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against a rusted pillar. He gasped, his eyes wide with panic. "Upstairs," he choked out. "The office." I released him, letting him collapse to the floor, and ran toward the metal staircase at the far end of the mill. The stairs groaned under my weight as I ascended, my breath coming in ragged gasps. At the top, I found a door slightly ajar, light spilling out into the darkened hallway. "Kimberly!" I called out, my voice echoing. "David!" Her muffled voice came from inside. I pushed the door open to find her tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears. Her scarf had been stuffed into her mouth as a gag, and her wrists were bound tightly with duct tape. I rushed to her side, pulling the gag free and tearing at the tape. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded frantically, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's insane, David. He kept saying he was going to make you pay. I thought he was going to kill me." "You're safe now," I said, freeing her hands. "Let's get out of here." As I helped her to her feet, a sound from below made me freeze. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, echoed through the mill. "He's coming," Kimberly whispered, her grip tightening on my arm. "Stay behind me," I said, scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusted metal pipe leaning against the wall. I grabbed it and positioned myself between Kimberly and the doorway, my heart pounding as the footsteps grew louder. Stephen appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with fury and desperation. He held the gun again, though his hand was unsteady. "You should have stayed out of this, David," he snarled. "Now neither of you are leaving." "Put the gun down, Stephen," I said, gripping the pipe tightly. "You don't want to do this." "You don't know what I want," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You've ruined my life, David. This is the only way to make it right." "No, Stephen," I said, my voice firm. "This won't make anything right. It'll only make things worse, for you, for Kimberly, for everyone." For a moment, his resolve seemed to waver. His hand shook, the gun dipping slightly. Kimberly stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Stephen, please," she said. "This isn't who you are." He looked at her, his expression softening for a brief moment before hardening again. "You don't know who I am," he shouted, raising the gun again. Before he could pull the trigger, I swung the pipe, striking his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor as Stephen cried out in pain, clutching his arm. I kicked the gun across the room and grabbed Stephen, shoving him against the wall. "It's over, Stephen," I said, my voice filled with quiet fury. "You've lost." His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. Kimberly grabbed the gun and held it tightly, her hands trembling as she aimed it at Stephen. "Kimberly, don't," I said, stepping in front of her. "It's over. Let the police handle this." She hesitated, then lowered the gun, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the mill. Relief flooded through me as I heard the distant shouts of officers entering the building. "It's over," I said again, my voice steadier this time. Stephen said nothing, his head hanging in defeat as the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the still night air as the police closed in. Within moments, officers swarmed the mill, their flashlights piercing the darkness. I raised my hands, stepping away from Stephen as they entered the room. "He's the one you want," I said, nodding toward Stephen, who sat slumped against the wall, clutching his injured wrist. Two officers approached cautiously, guns drawn, while another secured the room. "Stephen Harrow, you're under arrest," one of the officers said, his voice firm. He pulled Stephen to his feet and began reciting his rights. Stephen didn't resist, his head hanging low, his eyes hollow. Kimberly stood frozen behind me, the gun still in her hand. An officer approached her, speaking gently. "Ma'am, I need you to put the gun down," he said, his tone calm but authoritative. She hesitated, her hands trembling, before finally setting the weapon on the ground. The officer secured it, and gestured for her to step aside. "It's over," I whispered, though the words felt heavy in my chest. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Stephen was taken into custody, charged with a slew of crimes ranging from kidnapping to assault. Rachel filed for divorce the next day, severing her ties to the man who had destroyed so much. Kimberly and I were questioned extensively by the police. I told them everything, the threats, the break-in, the confrontation at the mill. Kimberly corroborated my story, her voice shaky but steady. Once the legalities were sorted, I dropped her off at the house without saying much. She tried to speak, but I shook my head. "Not now, Kimberly," I said. "I need time to think." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, David. I promise. But I wasn't sure there was anything left to fix. The following weeks were a blur of court proceedings and media coverage. Stephen's fall from grace was as public as it was complete. His company severed all ties, disavowing him and cooperating with authorities investigating the embezzlement. Rachel reached out to me once, thanking me for standing up to Stephen and helping her finally see the truth. "You saved more lives than just your own," she said, her voice heavy with gratitude. But her words didn't ease the weight I carried. Kimberly, for her part, tried to make amends. She attended therapy, reached out to friends for support, and offered heartfelt apologies at every opportunity. But each attempt felt hollow. One evening, she found me sitting on the porch, staring out at the sunset. "I know I've ruined everything," she said quietly, sitting beside me. "But I want you to know how sorry I am, David. For all of it." I didn't look at her. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did, Kimberly. It doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal, or the pain." "I know," she whispered. "But I'm willing to spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." I turned to her, my expression unreadable. "Sometimes there's no going back. Sometimes the damage is too great." Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded. "If you want me to leave, I will." I didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched between us, heavy and final. "I'll be filing for divorce," I said finally. Her breath itched, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her tears falling silently. The divorce was swift and amicable, though the emotional toll was anything but. Kimberly moved out shortly after, taking only what she needed. The house felt quieter without her, but it was a silence I welcomed. Life didn't return to normal. It never would. But with time, I began to rebuild. I focused on my work, my friendships, and myself. Stephen's trial ended with a lengthy prison sentence, and I took solace in the fact that justice had been served. As for Kimberly, I heard through mutual friends that she moved to another city, starting fresh. She reached out once, sending a letter filled with apologies and promises to be a better person. I never replied. One evening, months later, I sat on the porch again, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool and quiet, a welcome reprieve from the chaos that had once consumed my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.